Tonight I want to talk to you about different types of Chassidus, in particular the relationship between the Rebbe and the Chassidim. But I'd like to start with 2 points I hope we can agree upon as background. The first is the status of expertise. Now, I have learned that in discussing responsibility, there's a certain psychological mechanism that's better to avoid in the discussion because you don't get an objective perspective. And that is, if you ask a person, are you responsible to do X or not? Do you think you have a responsibility to do X or not? Very often, especially with Americans, you'll get a defensive reaction. Don't tell me what to do. Don't push me around. Don't force your rules on me. It's as if you're robbing them of their freedom by discussing what people are responsible to do or not. So I have a suggestion. This is only psychological. It has nothing to do with logic. I have a suggestion. Don't ask people what responsibilities there are. Ask people what others whose actions affect them have a responsibility to do. Not what they have a responsibility to do, where you get a defensive reaction, but other people, someone who borrowed your car, someone who's watching your children, someone who's investing your money. Ask them what responsibility those people have. That's a very different perspective. You know, they're responsible to me. If they don't behave responsibly, I'm going to lose. That gives a very different background to the question. So, the question that I wanted to ask is this. What is the place of expertise in making responsible decisions? I have a very strong view on this, but let me give you a couple of examples and then you tell me how you feel about them. Let's imagine George is a third-year medical student. And he is taking a course on accidental injury. And in the course is a chapter which deals with some particular kind of complex injury. And the author of the book describes what should be done. George doesn't get it. George doesn't agree. He thinks it's a mistake. So he argues in class. He goes to the professor and argues. And the professor gives him the arguments that are in the literature. And George doesn't agree. So the professor says, let's write to the author of the book. He's an expert on accidental injury. Let's see what he says. So they write, and George puts his points, and the author of the book writes back, this and this is what you should do, which is what the professor said, what's in the book. And George says, well, I don't agree. Okay, he's a third-year medical student. Now he's out on the highway. There's an accident. This took place 40 years ago when people did pull over to try to help people. They don't do that anymore. And there's a person lying on the pavement with exactly the injury that he has been discussing with his professor and with the author of the book. What should George do? Should he do what he honestly and truly believes should be done? Or should he do what the textbook says and what the author says, the professor says? Let's try to test your intuitions by imagining that he does one or the other and it ends up badly. He ends up paralyzed from the waist down. In which case, does George have a better defense? Logically and morally better defense. I did what I honestly felt to be the right thing to do. I was honest and authentic. Or I did what medical expertise says to do. I hope it's obvious. Yes, I've given away my position by my tone. I did not present it neutrally. Obviously, he has a much better defense morally and legally if he followed the best medical expertise. Sure, experts can be wrong, but experts get it right a much greater percentage of times than other people. Since he's acting on somebody else, he has a responsibility to do for the somebody else the best that he can do. And the best that he can do is do it on the basis of expertise. Second example, George borrows your car. You're going away to the Bahamas for a month. And you tell George, I'm happy to have you use it. Sitting for 30 days without being used could harm the car. I'm just telling you, sometimes the brakes get loose. So if you feel a pull on the brakes, go get them tightened. So fine, bye. You come back from your lovely vacation to the Bahamas, and you come home to find your car decoratively wrapped around a tree. Phew, you say, George, what happened? Well, you see, the steering slipped, and that's where it ended up. I said, George, I told you. Did the steering start to pull? Did it feel loose? He said, yeah. So what did you do? He said, I fixed it. I fixed it. You fixed it. Are you an auto mechanic? No, I read the book, and I fixed it. I said, George, didn't we agree that you should take it to a mechanic to fix it? Yeah, but I do things my way. You know, wasn't there a song, I Did It My Way?
Frank Sinatra.
Frank Sinatra. Oh, as far back as that? Well, I have a parody on that song. At the age of 7, I had my first marijuana cigarette. And by 11, I was shooting up crack. And by 16, I was the head of a gang stealing money to pay for the crack. And by 20, I was in the penitentiary. But I did it my way. You know, my way is the adverb. What about the verb? What about what you did? Doesn't that matter? It's just one of the many silly things in the American psyche. Okay, so now I think that you're not going to be happy with George. You're going to say, listen, it's my car. You're using my car. You ought to have done it in the safest way possible, which would be to ask an expert. So I hope we can agree that in many situations in life depend upon detailed, accurate knowledge of what's going on, and experts are the ones who have more of that detailed, accurate knowledge than other people. So one's decisions should be based on that kind of consultation. That's the first background point. The second background point is, how much do details matter? I think the right answer is it depends a lot on context. If you are writing an email and you're writing the address to which you want to send the email, no mistakes are tolerated at all, period. Any failure of any note, any symbol, it won't get there. Too bad. 90% isn't good enough. And if you belong to a persecuted minority, isn't good enough. Email will not go unless it has the right address. Let's say you're a musician, you're a violinist, and you're playing in an orchestra. Well, first of all, the note that you play is in the music. And second of all, there's a tyrant called the concertmaster, or the first violinist, who will tell you what string to play it on, whether to play it on an up bow or a down bow, how much vibrato to put into it. All you do is take orders. And you take orders down to every detail. Ask about a ballet dancer when he jumps. What does he have in mind? Well, one thing he has in mind is not landing in such a way that he'll break his ankle. That's true, he has that in mind. He also has the slope of his eyebrows in mind and the tension in his fingers. He's portraying something. People are watching, in particular, his physical movements. His physical movements have to be organized to be able to portray that mood, idea, whatever it is, and every muscle will be programmed. If you're in the army or playing football, you've got 11 guys, and you're going to pull off a play that requires all 11 to do exactly what they're supposed to do. Otherwise, it won't work, or it will only work badly. There are contexts in life where the details are very important. If controlling the details can make a substantial contribution to the value of the outcome, then you want the details to be controlled. True, sometimes the details don't matter. But if you're in a context in which the details matter, then people don't rebel against it on the grounds that it's obsessive compulsive to worry about details, because it really can make a difference. Okay, so now Jewish practice is complicated, it's based on a vast literature, it's detailed, both in terms of the details of performance and the general themes of performance and the general values and the belief system. And we are told that anything that contributes to the outcome is valuable. Some details are necessary. If the detail is not done correctly, then the performance is invalid. You put on tefillin. In the tefillin there are parchments. They have letters inscribed on them. Any letter that isn't valid, one letter, and the whole performance is invalid. Other times the details are important, but not so much so that they render the performance invalid, but they contribute. So it seems to me that we are in a context in which expert advice, expert direction, expert guidance in order to maximize the value of one's Jewish performance is required. Here, of course, the first sense is that you're responsible to do it because of your responsibility to God, but then that also affects other people as well. It's a compound situation, but the idea of expertise seems to me applies here with considerable force. Are we together so far? Okay, so now suppose someone says, well, then really you shouldn't do anything without asking an expert. Do you ever get to the point where you make your own decisions? Is it really true that every Orthodox Jew has a cell phone with a prime number being the number of the rabbi, and he calls them 25 times a day? And what do people do before cell phones? So the answer is that there is a time when it becomes appropriate for you to make your own decisions. So when is that? It's when an expert certifies that you are capable of making your own decisions. So when you have children, you'll see this operate in detail. At what point in the child's development do you allow the child to cross the street by himself? When he has demonstrated to you, through experience and questioning and examples, that he has understood and mastered the rules of safely crossing the street. So when he's 4, you hold his hand. And when he's 5, you could stand with him at the light and say, you tell me when you think it's right to cross the street. You look up and down, you tell me. See how often he gets it right. If he gets that right, you say, okay, we're going to cross the street. I'm not going to hold your hand. Just walk next to me. Walks next to you, he's tempted, doesn't see a ball and run over to get the ball. You say, okay, he's got that. Then you might set up artificial circumstances. Under what conditions is it right to cross the middle of the street? If he gives the answer, none, you say, good. He says, well, when it's a very expensive ball that went into the street. I said, sorry. No, hold my hand for the meantime. We're not having that.
What do you like to see in life?
When he gets to the point where you have good reason to believe he's got the rules, he understands them, and he's self-controlled enough to follow them, then you tell him you can decide when to cross the street. Now let's make an analogy to that. When should a mother, yes, this is very sexist, when should a mother trust her child in the kitchen with the food alone? Well, I think when the child has some idea of what kashrus is and what the rules are and what you can do, what you can't do. If he doesn't realize the red drawer is one thing and the blue drawer is another thing, it's probably not right to leave him in there alone to fix his own food. So a person makes his own decisions about kashrus when he has been certified by an expert. An expert could be a parent who knows the rules of kashrus. To know enough rules so that, number one, most of what the person does is correct, and number two, if something happens, the person is well enough informed to know, yes, ask a question. When those two, of course, the judgment isn't perfect, it's not 100%, but that's the kind of certification that leads to people being trusted to make their own decisions. And if a person has not been certified, then he's simply irresponsible in doing it on his own. Just like the medical student who treats the injury on the grounds that that's what I truly believe is irresponsible. So is, well, let's see. The water in the kettle was only 70 degrees centigrade. It wasn't boiling, so I thought it was okay when I poured the milk onto the milky thing with a fleshig thing. Because 70 degrees is, really? Oh, well, are you guessing? Did you try pouring it on your hand? 70 degrees will give you a burn. So, if a person's like that, then it's not appropriate to invite him to use the kitchen on his own. That's the way it is throughout Jewish life. You learn a set of laws. You learn the normal procedure by watching other people, and people can tell whether you've learned it or not by watching you. Do you know what to do in every new circumstance that will arise? No, but you know it's new from having lived through like davening in the morning, talis, tefillin. You've lived through it enough times to know what the normal procedure is, so you can identify something that's abnormal, and then you know to ask. Those are the conditions to which you don't have to be on the cell phone with the expert all the time, and that makes you a responsible agent. Are we together so far? Okay. Yeah.
What about when you have the knowledge, but like let's say you're reaching out for chizuk, right? So you have a good sense that, oh, I'm capable here, I know, but for whatever reason internally, like I'm having struggle with this, is it appropriate to still ask, even though you are certified with the expertise?
Yeah, you're asking the opposite question from what I'm asking. I'm asking, when is it wrong to avoid expertise? You're asking whether it's also appropriate to ask an expert for things where you wouldn't be blamed for not going. I think you're right. You're 100% right. And when I get to the directly Hasidic portion of this, I'll talk about that. Yeah.
Would the same apply to questions sort of about your life, where there might be you might know yourself better than the person you're asking?
This is a very important point. You're asking whether the fact that you know yourself better than anybody else might be a factor in the reliability of the decision. I would challenge your premise. I don't think you know yourself better than other people, because although you have more experience with yourself than anybody else does, you also have, if you're a normal person, a number of quite strong built-in biases. You want to rationalize what you do. You want to think that you're living up to a certain self-image. Oh, you finally figured out that I'm going up. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Just take a little bit of insulin here. Now, I've made skeptical remarks about psychologists a number of times, but certainly they will all agree that other people can know you better than you know yourself, certainly in particular areas. So I don't think you should trust that. Now, having said all of that, many, many years ago, I had a close friend. I'm so friendly with him, but I don't see him very often, who is a Chassidus fellow. And he told me there are three types of rebbies. There's three types of Chassidus. One is a Rebbe who drives a wagon and invites you to go along for the ride. The second is a Rebbe who sits in the back of your wagon, the kind of backseat driver. You're driving, but he's sitting in the back seat telling you what to do. And the third is a Rebbe who runs an inn, a tavern. You drive your own wagon. You're out on the road alone. From time to time, you stop into the tavern, you take up issues that you have with the Rebbe, get decisions from him, or advice from him, or inspiration from him, or direction from him, and then you go out and drive your own wagon. There are three types of Chassidus. with 3 types of rebbies. Now, I'll wager, both for you sitting here and for those who are listening to the recording, if you're Americans, you're all applauding number 3. Of course you have to drive your own wagon. What do you mean? You're going to ride in somebody else's wagon? He's going to drive? Well, you're not running your own life. You don't have a genuine life. And that means, since you're all applauding number 3, you haven't paid attention to what I said, and you haven't accepted what I said. I went over, like, dug off water off a duck's back, right? Let me give you an extreme example, which actually has happened. Happened a couple of years ago. I remember from decades ago. 2 people are up in a 2-person airplane. The pilot and a passenger. The passenger is not a pilot. Suddenly, the pilot slumps over. He's at least unconscious. Maybe he's dead. The passenger's up in a plane. Huh? What's he going to do? But the radio to the tower is on. So he says, help! The pilot's not functioning. Right. Now, he gets a voice from the tower. This has actually happened. We'll talk you down. We'll tell you what to do. It's been done before. We'll tell you what to do, and you can land safely. And it actually works. It has worked on a number of occasions. You see that steering wheel in front of you? Well, grab hold of it and pull it towards you. And the 3rd pedal on the left, step down on it gently. And when the red light starts blinking, push that button, and they talk you down, right? Well, let's see. Are you likely to feel inhibited, victimized? Why are they giving me orders, Why can't I do what I feel I should do? When I feel, I hope not, I think you feel, thank God for the radio, Thank God somebody knows how to give me instructions. Because I don't want to die. I want to land safely. So this guy who's riding in the back, the first in group number 1, why is he riding in the back of the wagon driven by the Rebbe? Because he says, I don't know enough. I know myself when circumstances arise and I offer my opinion, very often it's contradicted. Very often I come to learn that I made a mistake. I'm just not good at this. And I want to get it right, because it's important to get right. So therefore, I'm going to take direction. There's nothing wrong with that, nothing incumbent about that. On the contrary, the person will have to overcome a kind of false autonomy and individualism which says, do things, I did it my way, no matter what I did. To be able to say, the best thing for me to do is to take direction. If you are a private in the army and you're infantry, you're fighting a battle, you better not disobey orders. Because you don't have a global picture of what's going on. But I was sure I could take that hill. So, there's nothing wrong with being in group 1 and group 2 and group 3. A person has to have self-knowledge to be able to choose where he belongs. I remember hearing in the United States Army that a person rose, now I think it goes, major is a rank before lieutenant, if I'm not mistaken, and he was a major, and he was offered what's the word for it? When you go up a level? To be an advancement, to become a lieutenant, and he refused it. He said, listen, I've been a major a couple of years. I know exactly what's required. I know that I'm able to do it, and do it well, and I know that I'm at my limit. And if you give me more, I'm not going to make it. There is a rule, what's it called, which says every person is promoted to his position of maximum incompetence. Why is that? Because every time you're promoted to a position you do well, then you qualify for another, that's where I wanted promoted. Then you qualify for another promotion. When do they stop promoting you? When you don't do well. So everybody's promoted to a position of maximum incompetence. Okay? So he said, I don't want that. I want to do a good job. And I know that this is where I can do a good job. So a person who says, I know that I'm a type 1, or I know that I'm a type 2, shouldn't be embarrassed, it shouldn't be treated as second class. he knows if he's accurate, if his judgment about himself is accurate. My Rebbes Zatzal represented Polish Chassidus, which is of type 3. And there were people who got close to him and were very enthused about Chassidus and wanted type 1 or type 2 direction. And the Rebbe said, not me. My Masorah, my tradition, is type 3, and that's what I'm offering. That's what I feel that I have to offer to people. There are other Chassidic movements that offer type 1 or type 2. Make your way there. I know a couple who did, and did very well, because that's what they needed. They needed to be told regularly, in the slightest variations, what to do. They were happy and successful that way. So one should not go back to worshiping, I did it my way, yeah. Let's take it. Oh, God. Yeah.
The three different types of rebellion, is it a difference in frequency as to when you ask, or is it a quantifiable difference between the type of questions you're asking?
Well, I think the one is dependent upon the other. If you don't ask with the same frequency, then a lot of detailed applications you're not going to ask about because they go by too fast. It means that you're getting general direction, general priorities, general conceptual clarification and inspiration, and you are trusted to apply things on your own. And I guess the point is, even if there's a variety of ways to do it and you pick one, you have enough understanding not to make any kind of serious, sizable mistake. And minor mistakes in good faith are tolerated, yeah.
So it sounds like there's potentially a tension between, maybe we can say that it's most important that the act gets done, that it's done properly, that's the highest priority. But if that's seen to, it's also good if you independently were the one who sort of performed it, but that's sort of secondary. But I'm also trying to consider a way that those two can work together, because it might be a situation where people are overtaxing the Rebbe. Like, he's one person, and they're like flooding him, and maybe they need to learn sort of like some self-reliance and general principles, so that one, they're developing that extra good of independence, but also so that they're not overtaxing the resource that they have.
Okay, both points are very important. I tried to be careful. I think I was successful. I said that if the person accurately understands himself and says that I belong to type 1 or type 2, then that's the place he should be. There should be no hesitation whatsoever. You're raising another question, which I think is a very important question. Suppose a person could function in all three types. Is there a preference as to where he should function? And there, I think, there is a preference, and that's a preference for type 3, because the more you engage your own capabilities, your own faculties, your own talents in serving Kodesh Baruch Hu, the more complete your service will be. If you have the capacity to make good judgments and you just give it up in favor of detailed compliance with detailed instructions, that part of your character is not being used. I think that makes it inferior. But this is a judgment that if you make it about yourself, you're taking a big chance, because there's a lot of rationalization, a lot of bias that goes into that. So, but I think that's right. I think that's part of the, how shall I say, part of the Polish preference for that, because when a person can do it, then he's doing the best that he can do. I heard a bitter type of illustration of this between two Hasidic movements, whose names I will not give. And one was saying about the other. And the person in the other group, if the Rebbe tells him to jump off the roof, he'll jump off the roof. Person in my group, if the Rebbe tells him to jump off the roof, he'll jump off the roof. But first he'll ask why. Not to reject and not to pass judgment on what the Rebbe is telling you to do, but he wants to understand. So the difference is not in obedience. Both will obey. What am I illustrating? that they have the capacity to understand why it's a higher performance doing it in terms of the reason that there is for it than doing it just blindly. I said that to you in another shir once. We don't prize blind obedience. Nasa v'nishma, we talked about it on Shavuos, right? You have to be prepared to do without understanding, because sometimes it takes too much time to understand it. Sometimes you're just not capable of understanding in terms of your educational level. But you must want to understand. You must look for understanding, because that's one of the ways in which you elevate your service for Kodesh Baruch Hu. Decision making and judgment making is also a way in which you elevate your service for Kodesh Baruch Hu. So if you are capable of that, then it's important that you should do that. Not only that, but the stronger you become in that, the more you can help other people, because you too can be a source of advice for other people. Now, as far as overtaxing the Rebbe, my training from my Rebbe and other people I've spoken to is don't take that into account at all. He's a big boy. He can decide how much he can take and how much he can't take and where he wants to invest. You go. You go and you ask, and either he'll tell you, I can't see you till next Friday, by which he means, I think you can manage till next Friday, and it's not that pressing. Let him take direction. This is similar to the idea of trying to figure out what God wants. If he makes people poor, he wants them to be poor, so don't give them money to disturb what he's doing. No. We have a set of rules. And the rules are there, and just try to figure out. Don't try to figure out what's good for the Rebbe. He'll tell you, Yeah.
So perhaps this is not the case, but I would imagine that maybe a person could grow in their, I guess, maybe confidence is the right word, and be ready to move types of Rebbes?
Absolutely.
Can one Rebbe be made to fit any of these three types, or does one have to find a new Rebbe if they're ready to move to?
Well, that's an interesting question. That's a very important question. I don't usually put that in. Yes, a Rebbe might be versatile enough to have different types of relationship with different people. That there could be. My Rebbe was in principle type 3. But not all Rebbes have to be that way. And then you could move up. Yes, of course, is capable. People are capable of developing capabilities of good judgment. Hooray! Every child goes through that, doesn't he?
Right.
He starts off terrible, and then little by little he grows and matures, and then some mature to more. And it can be context to context. It could be that a person in dry halacha is very good, but in figuring out in interpersonal relations what the Torah would want you to do for a person would be very primitive and crude. The first is a man, the second is a woman. I didn't say that. Don't quote me. I'll deny it. You have the tape. Somebody else spliced it.
Would there ever be a Hasidic movement with two Rebbes? Is that contradictory?
Oh no! Now you're switching gears. Before we were talking about one Rebbe playing several roles.
Right.
Now you're talking about two Rebbes. You do have Hasidic movements with two leaders, each of whom has his own group, but they're very friendly, and they make joint religious performances together, and the groups fraternize with one another. It's just that one group goes to the one Rebbe for their advice, for their direction, and the other goes to the other. Would that be called one group with two Rebbes? Probably not, but it's close to it. You could, however, conceivably is possible. And I'll give you an illustration in non-Hasidic groups where something like this is done. I'm trying to think now if I know of any Hasidic groups that do actually what you say. Not sure, but let me tell you what happens in Lithuanian groups, especially in Lita. For all I know, it's still true in largely Lithuanian populations post-war. In Lita, if you had a yeshiva in a town, one person was the Rosh Yeshiva. He ran the yeshiva. He gave the top shir in the yeshiva, probably decided who should be hired and what shir they should give. But he did not paskin shalos. He did not give practical decisions as to what to do in practical cases. And he was the Rav of the town. And the difference is there's a whole literature, responds to literature, which typically the Rosh Yeshiva didn't know. So he was trained in all the literature in interpreting Talmudic text and other similar texts. And the Rav of the town was trained in the practical literature of practical decisions. And therefore, if you went to the Rosh Yeshiva and asked him a question, is this chicken kosher or treif? He would say, go to the Rav. And he'll give you an answer. Because he wasn't trained in it. So there you have two types of Torah leadership within the same community, divided that way. My Rebbe, when I first got started, told me that we have entered the age of specialization. I was with him for 47 years, and he's gone 13 years, so it was 60 years ago. He said the age of specialization, and you can have different Rebbe's for different Rebbe-like functions. So I talked about making decisions, and someone else, you I think, asked about inspiration, right? And that's certainly true. There are certain people whose prayers are just very inspiring. You feel like you're standing next to him in front of the throne of glory. But he's not an expert in Jewish law, not an expert. He's knowledgeable, obviously, otherwise his prayers wouldn't be exalted. But that isn't what he can give you. In the Gemara already. What am I talking about? In the Gemara already. They talk about having two Rebbe's, one for Girsa and one for Svara. Learning the things that you had to learn by heart, like the whole of the Mishnayos. The Talmudic sages knew the whole of the Mishnayos by heart. Not all the Rices, Tosfos says, but all the Mishnayos they knew by heart. So that was learning with repetition, learning and being tested, learning and being tested. You had one Rebbe for Girsa and a different Rebbe for Svara. Those are two parts of scholarship, and you absorb them from two different people. So this idea of splitting it up, I think, is perfectly acceptable in principle. I just don't know of any Chassidus that ran with two Rebbes for any purposes. Now I will tell you something else. In many cases, the Chassidus ran, the Rebbe was at the top, and he had many intermediaries who carried his ideas and his principles to other people because of what you said about not having time to see everybody individually. So, like it says with Moses, right, when he had the 70, he said, Yisro said to him, you should have intermediaries, and the pedestrian questions they'll ask them, and the difficult ones they'll ask you, and that's how it was set up. So the idea of intermediaries goes all the way back to Moses. So that's something which you know. But that's not two Rebbes. They're not co-equal in authority. But they do, the function of teaching and inspiring the people is split up and delegated to a large extent. That you do have. You have a question?
Yeah. So if somebody has, it's particularly, let's say if somebody's not necessarily a Chassidish person, and he meets a given Rebbe, and he sees this Rebbe seems like a very holy person, and the Rebbe, is kind to him and says, "Come again, come see me," But he feels like, what do I have? I don't have any. This Rebbe is not involved in my life. I'm not part of a Chassidish community, Chassidish life, so it's not like, things in my life are intimately related to things that maybe I would go consult for practical questions and answers from this Rebbe. So, like, what would you say to that person? Like, he sees this is a holy person, and he's saying, he's extending an invitation for you to come see me whenever you would like. But at the same time, like, you feel like, well, what do I have to go talk to him about or say to him or get from him? Like,
Well, I think there are two things to say here. First of all, what I'm going to say now may sound a little crude, but for better or for worse, that's the way I see it. If you're considering adopting a person as a Rebbe, I recommend going. You certainly have questions, unanswered questions. You have battles that you're struggling with, which you have not yet perfectly overcome. You have hopes for the future. Go and ask him about things that are relatively small, relatively inconsequential. I'm having trouble concentrating during the Shemona Esrei. How would you give me an advice how to handle that, or whatever it is? And take his advice and see if it works. If it works, that means that wherever he's coming from, you see that where he's coming from matches where you are and what you need. If he gives you a piece of advice, you could discuss it with him, ask questions about it, and see how he answers. It may very well be that, surprise to you, he'll demonstrate that he understands your circumstances very well. A Rebbe sees lots and lots of people. And those lots and lots of people have lots and lots of different life situations. He is a clearinghouse for, I would say, social work experience. And he cares about people, and people keep coming back to him because he's someone who they feel has helped them in certain ways. So I think the assumption that he won't have anything in common or won't know what's going on is a rash assumption. By the way, I should say, to avoid other prejudices, Chassidim vote with their feet. There's no rule that the children of a Belzer Chassid have to be Belzer Chassidim. There's no such rule. Indeed, there's no rule that the children of a Chassidish parent have to be Chassidish. There is no such rule. It's not locked in. The rules of the system are not built that way. I have 3 sons, 2 of whom are not Chassidish at all. And I don't find anything wrong with that. I don't see anything. They are people who serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu to the best of their ability around the clock. And I'm just as proud of them as I am of my 3rd son, who is Hasidic. So if a person has a reputation, if he has lots of followers, it means there are a lot of people who feel that their spiritual lives are being improved. That doesn't mean that any one person is the right person for everybody. But it does mean that they have probably a far wider experience than you would expect. I know someone who went to a great deciser. This was maybe 50 years ago. He still runs a girls' school for potential Bali Tshuva, and question was whether this girl was married according to Jewish law. She had a live-in relationship with a boy, and some people think it is, some it isn't, but who knows? It's a complicated shaila. So the rabbi to whom he asked the shaila said, what city was this in? He said, the one asked the shaila, he said, it was in Los Angeles. And the rabbi, world-famous, great, holy rabbi, said, are you aware that in Los Angeles, people live together without any intention of getting married? Are you aware of that? And meaning that, of course, if they weren't intending to be married, it was just a live-in affair, and other people knew about it, but they knew it wasn't a marriage, so then it wouldn't be counted as marriage. But the person asking the question was a little surprised that this so-called cloistered rabbi knew very well that in Los Angeles, living together with no intention of staying together was common, and he took it upon himself to inform this other rabbi who's more worldly of this fact. So don't assume that they don't know. Don't assume they don't. That's one thing. Or 2 more things. Second of all, they have Siyata D'Shmaya. They have the help of heaven, these people. So that's an ingredient that you definitely would like in the direction that you get. And third of all, understanding people isn't different in type from understanding math or understanding subway engineering or anything else. There are people who are geniuses about it. You say, how can you know a person when you spoke to him for 5 minutes? So suppose he tells you, listen, I asked him about his childhood. And what he told me was, I had this pet dog, and I loved the dog. Not father, not mother, not brother, not sister, not teacher, not the dog. Doesn't that tell you something? But you didn't think of that. You said, talk about the dog, so what? That's what he chose to talk about. No, it means a lot. Then there's body language. How's his body language? You may not be sensitive to body language, but there is such a thing, and a person sitting with somebody for 5 minutes can read it. I think that Rebbes have a combination of all 3. They have gigantic amount of experience. They have a certain genius for this, otherwise they wouldn't be successful as Rebbes. People would leave them and go elsewhere. New people arise and attract a following. I'm trying to think of his name. And he says, I'm not a Rebbe, and he has like 1,000 people following him because when you're around him, you do better. When you're around him, you lift it up. When you're around him, you're inspired. When he gives you advice, the advice works. So it's a fluid system. It's not a system that's built on rigid rules that keep people where they don't want to belong. So that's what I would say about that. Yeah.
Are there any hard red lines in which the Rebbe shouldn't interfere, or is it just sort of personal?
I don't think there could be. I don't know how I would be able to say there was such a line. By the way, I would say a preliminary judgment, this isn't always necessary. Let me put it this way. Something which can be a strong recommendation for a Rebbe is if from time to time he says he doesn't know. Same thing with a posek. Well, I'll have to look it up. I'll have to ask someone. Because a person who can't say I don't know sounds like a person who can't admit that he doesn't know, and then his judgments are not going to be that reliable. My Rebbe used to do that often enough. Often enough, yeah.
Perhaps this is a little controversial, but at a yeshiva like Ohr Somayach, how can we learn more about Chassidus and see if Chassidus is maybe right for us? Or...
I'll tell you, I think there's a conflict of interests here, and I've come to see it. My Rebbes, that's how I think, supported it as well. If you're a Ohr Somayach, that means you're getting your beginning education. A very recommended strategy, I won't say it's the only strategy, but a very recommended strategy is devote your initial education to what you need no matter where you go. You're going to have to be competent in Gemara to whatever extent you can be wherever you go. You're going to have to know basic halacha. You have to know basic hashkafa. You have to know how to daven. You have to know about the laws of the holidays. These are things which, without them, you can't be part of any Jewish community. After you have the basics in hand, then it's time to go exploring things which will identify you with one community as against another community. I think being distracted from the basics by working on things that are individual can cost you in the strength of your preparation of the basics. That's one of the reasons why Ohr Somayach stresses Gemara so much. Because if we are the people of the book, you may have heard that lovely poetic phrase which is written by an Apikoros. The book is not the Bible. The book is the Gemara. The Gemara is the spectacles through which we see the world, including the Bible. Every commentator on the Bible was an expert in Gemara before he wrote and before he'd be trusted to comment on the Tanakh. So, getting to whatever level you can in the sophistication of learning Gemara is something that will serve you wherever you go. And that's where the emphasis ought to be. Now, in the meantime, there are vacations, there are Shabbosos that you go away. There's no reason why you can't explore in that sort of minor way. But I wouldn't recommend going off to a yeshiva which spends 40% of the day learning their Hasidic tracts. Because if you end up someplace else, it won't be useful to you. Not directly useful to you. Learn the things that are necessary to learn. Yeah.
Going back to where if you a certain rabbi and you have a chance to be able to develop a connection if you would want, but what if you, as far as whatever question you have rebbeim in your life already?
You have what? You have what?
You have your rebbeim in your life already. Who you speak to, who are in your yeshiva or whatever.
Okay, I didn't mean by Rebbe. I used a little R. I don't know how he wrote it on the sign. I didn't mean now people who wear fur hats on Shabbos. I meant, and the word Rebbe is a word in the Gemara. And by the way, it can be used for the person who teaches you woodwork or piano. You know, he's the Rav of that thing. He's the teacher of that thing. So I didn't mean Hasidic rabbis in particular, although I did put Chassidus into the title. You need someone to lean on. You need someone to inspire you, to answer your questions, to give you better information than you can have on your own. And if you have, let's say, a close relationship with the person who's teaching you Gemara, let that do it.
Right. So the question just is, like, if you have met somebody who objectively is very holy, and it's like, is there any benefit to, like, on the one hand, you have your rebbeim already, but now you objectively, this person is a very special person. Maybe is there some way you should, like, try to find room?
Well, I think so, because you want to have the inspiration of that person, but usually, whatever rebbeim you have unanswered questions. And sometimes the Rebbe will say, I don't know how to answer that question. And you could take one of those questions to this person and see whether, at the very least, he couldn't, so to speak, supplement at the top. Not keep you going, running day by day, and not joining his group. I was by my Rebbe for, I guess, 10 years already. And I had an argument with my first wife. She said that I'm a chassid. And I said, I'm not a chassid. What are you talking about? In those days, I davened Ashkenaz, and I wore sandals, and I wore a kippah srugam, I had havaras faradit, and I didn't do any of my Rebbe's customs. Nothing. I said, what are you talking about? Not a Rebbe? And she said, you are. So I didn't pay the attention that I should have paid. And then, some time later, I was talking to the Rebbe and said, by the way, my wife tells me that I'm your chassid. And I said it with a sort of chuckle. And he said, you are. I said, really? He said, yes, because when you have a question about your spirituality, you come to me. So my Rebbe said, the fact that you don't wear my coat, or wear my hat, or pronounce Hebrew words the way I pronounce them, that's not what I call a Rebbe. A Rebbe is someone who guides you in your spirituality. So that's another way of looking at what the Rebbe is doing. So now, you're in yeshiva and you're learning Gemara and you're happy doing that, so on and so on, but priorities with your family, or davening more and taking time against learning and so forth and so on. These are subtle issues, and they're long issues of long-term influence. You may want to go to somebody who has a reputation for holiness and want to ask him those questions. I don't see why you can't split your ticket.
I'm wondering about those questions. Situations that you might intuit to yourself are almost like personal traps you're laying before yourself. So sometimes when you ask a question, you might have an inkling that really it's a kind of arrogance you're sort of bringing forward. So maybe you ask, well, I have this one job, it's 200,000, but another job is like 220,000. So you realize that you're looking for an avenue to brag almost, and that's a motivation built into the question. How do you deal with sort of the questions that you feel are missteps? And
well, that's one of the reasons.
How do you then set aside that guilt, potentially, if it is a question that still needs to be asked anyways?
What's guilt? Guilt because that I'm not perfect? Guilt that I'm not God? I don't hear any guilt over here. But I think that's a good matter of self-knowledge, especially when it's a question about what you should do about a subtle situation. That's what I said to him before. It's not true that we know ourselves better. I mean, you know yourself better, let alone your. Let me give you an example. I wanted to this beginning, then I'm going to quit. Of how a person can think he's right and be sure he's right, and then realize that just because he doesn't know the situation well enough, because he didn't ask an expert about it, that he's making maybe making a moral mistake. There are people who feel that if you earned money, it's your money, you earned it fairly. No one should take away your money against your will. Don't force me to do charity. That's my decision. If I want to give charity at all, to whom I want to give it. Libertarian types. Don't taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor is just violating people's autonomy, and it's wrong. There is something that's called the marginal utility of money. $1,000 is worth less to Bill Gates than it's worth to me. Take $1,000 from Bill Gates, he won't notice the difference. It'll make absolutely no difference to his life. Give me an extra $1,000, and it will make a sizable difference to my life. So, listen carefully. When you take money from the rich and give it to the poor, you increase the value of the money. The money is more valuable now. When you talk about the value possessed by the society as a whole, it's not just a question of the sum total resources, it's also a question of who has it. The money in the community has more value if you redistribute it this way. When I heard that, I thought, wow, there's a whole extra moral dimension here that I wasn't even appreciating. I don't know if it's right to take from the rich and give to the poor, but I certainly wasn't considering that. Now, there are people who are thoughtful people, educated people, who may have aspects of the situation that you're not even aware of. That's one of the things you get when you go to expertise. Not just to do what they say, but also to learn that there are features that you're not taking into account and that you want to think more deeply about. And if you see that this person knows 16 such features, and he's only been able to acquaint you with 2, you might say, well, until the years go by, while I get the other 14, maybe he'd be better off making better decisions than I would because he's got the other 14 and I don't. That's what you learn when you consult expertise, not just for a yes or no answer, but consult them for learning something about the subject. And if this is true for university and that sort of thing, it's certainly true for serving a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Okay, that's an introduction to the 3 types of Chassidus.
Thank you so much.